Hello and welcome to Head On with Minaz Merchant, our current affairs show that puts the facts first and the narrative next, instead of fixing a narrative and then molding the facts to fit it. Not the right way. I'm happy to have with us today a full house. Vatsala Mendonca D'Souza, a senior journalist and author, is with us again, and Alisa Noor, a journalist, and Parth Shukla, a journalist. Parth, a law graduate and a journalist, XIC, Xavier's Institute of Communication. Alisa also from the Xavier's Institute of Communications, both raring to go on the subject that we are going to talk about today, which is how the foreign media reports on India and often, far too often, misreports on India.
Minaz, I'd like to ask you, the very first question has to be on the Reuters March 6th report. They used the high satellite images that we've all been hearing about to prove that there really wasn't the damage that the Indian army claimed there was. What are your thoughts on that?
No, Vatsala, the Reuters report that you're talking about was on the 6th of March, which was a Wednesday. And it was written by 3 people in Reuters. The main byline was Martin Howell, who is the Reuters editor-in-chief in India. He was the editor-in-chief of Reuters in America, New York, till about a year ago. It had 2 basic fault lines, so 2 basic errors in their reportage. Number one, while they talked about the Balakot attack and how ineffective it was, and fundamentally disbelieving the Indian Air Force version of the success of the strike, what Reuters did was not mention 2 relevant facts, without which this becomes very poor reportage. Number one, they did not mention, even though they knew about it, report by Francesco Marino, an Italian journalist, who had written an article in First Post days before this March 6th Reuters report, in which he had interviewed locals who'd seen 35 bodies being taken out in ambulances from the Balakot strike area. Not mentioned at all by Reuters. Because when you're talking about a particular issue and saying, oh, we don't think that the information given out by the Indian government, by the Indian Air Force is credible, then you also have to balance it, which is called good journalism. Not balancing it is called bad journalism. And how do you balance it? By giving the opposing point of view, which is Francesco Marino, an Italian journalist, well known, and her point of view should have been included in the report. So that was really an infarction. The second error in this report of Reuters on March 6th was that they did not mention anywhere that they were not allowed to go to the scene of the strike, Chaba, which is a distance away from where they were taken. Now, they were denied permission 3 times in the past week or 10 days. And they say that 2 days later in a report on March 8th. So they tried to make up and said, oh, we were denied permission. But on March 6th, 2 days earlier, they knew that they'd been denied permission by the Pakistan authorities to go up to the site. They were hiding something, and it was obligatory on the part of Reuters to say that we were denied permission. Because they knew they were denied permission on the 6th of March. They admitted that 2 days later that they were denied 3 times. They couldn't have been denied on the 8th and the 7th and the 7th again. They were obviously denied pre-6th March. They did not mention that, and they did not mention the Marino report about 35 bodies. One-sided reportage is poor journalism, as far as Reuters is concerned. I think, Parth, you have a comment to make on the India Today television commentary that highlighted the success, the efficacy of the strike. So you would like to make a comment on that?
Yes, sir. So India Today had recently come out with a reveal when they claim that they have proof of the effectiveness of the airstrikes. They also claim to have phone records of conversations with a mosque worker who claims that at least 4 to 5 Pakistani army personnel were killed, and the strikes were somewhat corroborated by a Balakot cleric as well. Now, this report has not been picked up by any major international news media.
Correct.
So that's there. So what do you think about that, sir?
No, this is again part of this whole, foreign bias of reporting on India. This is the misreporting that we're talking about. And there's a long history of that, which we'll come to later. But definitely the fact that this, what we talked about, the Reuters report, was one-sided, poor journalism. The India Today TV report, which was, very evocative, and there was proof on the table, on tape, not picked up by any international news agency or newspaper or TV network. Not a good idea at all in terms of, good ethical journalism. So I think that's, certainly from what you tell me about the India Today TV report, it just underscores the kind of poor quality reportage, which we'll go into the reason for that in a bit, that emanates from a large section of the Western media.
So there's also there's something about Al Jazeera as well, the well-known Middle Eastern media.
Yes, yes.
They, like Reuters, have used the Planet Labs images to disprove the IAF's claim, not to directly
the
IAF's claim, not to directly disprove, but at least to put questions on the efficacy of the strikes. And they again also do not mention or pick up on the India Today report. And like you said, they also do not mention the report by Francisco Marino.
Right.
So do you see an obvious bias there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, if you look at this entire sequence of events on the Balakot strike, a definite case of bias. And that reflects badly on those newspapers. It doesn't reflect badly on us or the IAF. Because, we have confidence in the IAF. Again, it's not blind confidence. There has to be evidence. It's been presented, we believe, to the government, the IAF imagery, high resolution. And there are, a lot of corroborative reports that show, as you said, 5 Pakistani army personnel killed in the strike, hundreds of terrorists who were there at that time in the hostel, because it's a U-shaped hostel there, which can house more than 300, 400 trainees, commanders, etc., trainers. They would have been destroyed by these bombs. So, that kind of bias has a long history. It's got a whole bunch of reasons, which we'll go into in due course in this program.
So,
yeah, Lisa, you've got a comment to make. Yeah, carry on.
So there's the New York Times as well.
Yes.
I mean, they chose to call the Pulwama attacks an explosion. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, it was much more than an explosion. And if the New York Times says it was just an explosion, it's not only rank bad journalism on the part of the New York Times, it's unethical. When 9/11 happened, would anyone call it an air crash, as an article a few days ago referred to it? No, they wouldn't, obviously. So this sort of reportage by the New York Times, which again has a long history of anti-Indian reporting, is one of a piece with all that we've been talking about. And certainly that report by the New York Times, that it was an explosion, they didn't talk about the fact it was a suicide bomber, 40 Central Reserve Police Force people had been killed, and the kind of mayhem that took place on the 14th of February. So to report it as an explosion was just unethical journalism beyond the pale. But is there anything else on...
in fact, that reminds me that the New York Times had issued an apology in 2015 regarding the Muslim poverty in Gujarat.
Yes.
So why do you think they did that?
No, you see, the New York Times, the article you're talking about, was a piece on the level of poverty among Muslims in Gujarat. Modi was then a year old as a prime minister, and the New York Times had been very anti-Modi right throughout, which is fine. They're entitled to their opinion, but they're not entitled to distortion of facts. That they're not entitled to. No one is. Then you don't become a journalist. You can go into some other profession. It's certainly not journalism. So this was pointed out to them that what you said was not factual. And when it was pointed out to them, the New York Times quickly published an apology saying, yes, we are very sorry we said that about Muslims in Gujarat being the poorest of all Muslims across the country. But actually, we have got new data. They'd used 2008 or 10 data, and the 2012 data makes it clear that actually, this is all the New York Times saying in their own editorial correction, that no, Muslims in Gujarat actually are much better off than Muslims in other states, and we made a mistake. So that's, again, poor journalism.
You've spoken a lot about the bias, the overall bias that the Western media has displayed in many of these events. But why? Why would they do this? What are the reasons behind it?
It's quite complicated. There are 4 reasons basically. Number one is geopolitical. The West has got a particular geostrategic interest in this region of South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, where Pakistan, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, holds a particular place. It's geostrategically well located. So there's a built-in geopolitical bias in favor of not upsetting Pakistan. There's Afghanistan, the Taliban. Pakistan has this whole business model of extortion, blackmail, basically telling the Americans and the British and the French that, look, we are terrorists. We know that. They don't say that quite, but it's obvious that we are funding terrorists. We are funding the Taliban. We created the Taliban in 1993. And if you want a settlement in Afghanistan, which is our backyard, then you've got to cooperate with us and not be pro-India. So there is that geopolitical imperative. The second is also there's a journalistic inbuilt bias among Western journalists, which is slightly based on a certain amount of colonial racism. There is that, oh, how dare India rise above their means. A few decades ago, they were a colony. And then gradually, India is becoming a big economic power. Last year, our GDP overtook France. This year, it will overtake Britain's GDP and will be the 5th largest in nominal terms economy in the world. So there's a amalgam of racism, which is it's hidden, it's deeply hidden, but it's there, and there is this element of envy. How can they do this? Envy, racism, bad amalgam, geopolitical strategic interests also define how Western governments think, work, and strategize. So these, if you put them all together, and then add the 4th element, which is money. When it comes to armaments, etc. In the Saudi example, the Yemen war we talked about, there is a monetary thing also. But because India is becoming a larger and larger economy, we're the 2nd largest weapons buyer in the world, gradually the reportage is changing and will change in the next few years. But until then, these are the 3 or 4 reasons why there is this inbuilt bias against anything that India does, and very little emphasis on our achievements, like the space program of ISRO, etc., IITs. There are lots of things that are good about India. The startup ecosystem, the 3rd largest in the world after America and China. They'll never write very much about that because it doesn't suit that agenda. And the Indian journalists who get published abroad and who get jobs abroad in think tanks are those who pander to this sort of reportage on this country. Yeah, Parth, if you have something to add.
So also going to the coverage of various international media houses, specifically on our Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Taking the example of Al Jazeera, their reportage usually centers around portraying him as mainly a right-wing leader. One report has even alluded him to be more right-wing than previous BJP leaders. And they also show that most of his policies, not directly, but they allude to it, that most of his policies have largely failed, and he is using, the current government is using the rising tensions with Pakistan to fuel their chances in the upcoming election. So what do you think about such coverage, sir?
No, you see, Al Jazeera is entirely run by the Qatar government. And Qatar, of course, has its own problems. It's been boycotted by the Saudi, the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, etc. So they have their own problems. Al Jazeera is also a channel which has a built-in anti-India bias. Many of their reporters have done pretty negative reporting on India. So I think the sort of coverage that you've talked about on Modi, and don't forget that Modi comes across as a person who's not particularly popular with media organizations because he doesn't give interviews. He's not the kind of person like many others who are open to Western journalists, and that is something that rankles a lot. And I believe, and we'll come to that later, but I do believe that Modi should be much more open. And frankly, even if he's demonized as a right-wing leader, that's fine. There are left-wing leaders, there are right-wing leaders, and again we'll be talking about that: right, left, center. The real problem is people don't understand that it's not ideology that matters, it's the issue that matters. On an issue, you can be right-wing or left-wing. Like, for example, LGBT rights. You've got to be socially left-wing or liberal completely. Freedom of expression, speech, etc. When it comes to free markets, you've got to be completely on the right, which means economic liberalization. So, based on the merit of an issue, you decide your position. It's not a set ideology that you should have. So, to call someone a right-wing leader or a left-wing leader, unless he or she is completely like that, and is didactic, it's completely wrong, because on certain things Modi has been quite illiberal on many issues, and on some like FDI, again he's been neither here nor there. Frankly, I think Modi hasn't done privatization to the extent he should have. He's done great schemes and all of that, but you can't define him only as a right-wing leader. But that's not even the point. The real point is he shouldn't care about it being defined as a right-wing leader. Only thing is he should be more accessible to the media so that people can make an informed judgment on his policies. That's all that matters.
Minas, can we move away from the Western media now and talk about how you feel Indian media handle some of these issues? Do you feel they're fair, biased?
Well, no, Vatsala, I think the Indian media also misreports a lot. Now, it's polarized. We know how badly polarized the Indian media is. Left, right, center. We spoke about that a short while ago. Focus on the issue. Don't focus on left or right ideology, because that makes you static. You can't change. You've got to be... See, the first definition of liberalism is that you have to have an open mind, open to different points of view, and to live in an echo chamber, which many of our journalists do. If you are a left-wing person, you sort of, gravitate towards others who are also left-wing. If you're right-wing, then you do the same. You gravitate towards others who are right-wing. That should not be the case. The left and the right must intermingle, and they'll find that on issues, if they go by issues and not by a static policy of being RW or LW, that they will have things in common. And many people who you typify as RW will actually have leftist views on certain issues, and people who you normally categorize as LW will have right-wing views on certain issues. So there's that amorphous kind of middle ground that we should try and increase the salience of in future. So yeah, polarization has occurred. It's occurred in the wrong way. It takes place in the way that channels are, pro a particular party. On the one hand, you have channels which are very pro-government, many of them, and then you have channels which are pro the Congress, again, one particular one, and maybe one or two others. So newspapers, again, there are 2 or 3 newspapers in the south, in the east, which are very much against Modi. There's this hate Modi cabal in journalists. Many journalists are by nature, and that's not wrong, left-leaning, because they're young, They're anti-establishment, as every young person should be. So journalists are like all creative people. Not that journalists are very creative, but like all creative people. I'm married to an artist, so I know. The artists, journalists, filmmakers, writers, authors, etc. are left-leaning. That's their natural sort of habitat. So you can't blame them too much. But the point is that this distinction between left and right has to ultimately be submerged into something which is issue-based. So hopefully channels that are pro this or pro that will moderate their stance. Newspapers in the south and east which are anti-government will moderate their stance. Newspapers which are slavishly pro-government will also temper their stance, and we'll get at the end of it good journalism. That should be the objective. Yeah, Lisa.
So I think it's high time that we talk about this. So what do you think about the fact that our Prime Minister hasn't held any press conference so far?
I think that's a very good question, and I think what Mr. Modi has done is a very bad thing. I think he should address press conferences on a regular basis. Now, he's very good at Hindi. He's a terrific orator. His English may not be perfect, but none of us speak perfect English. It's not our mother tongue. So it's perfectly all right for him to take questions live or even recorded without any intervention from journalists from left, right or center. It doesn't matter. And I think he should do it on a regular basis. I think it's a big mistake that he's made in the past 58 months that he hasn't held a single press conference. I think it's not a good thing. It's not particularly democratic, and I think that if he'd held press conferences, he would have been able to get rid of a lot of the disinformation and the misinformation that circulates in the absence of no information. Because as I say, the only thing worse than misinformation and disinformation is no information. And two things. One, the PM should have regular press conferences, and it's terrible that he hasn't had. It would have actually helped him, because he would have been able to really, make his position clear across issues. And there are journalists who are anti him. As I said, they are left-leaning by nature. So what? All the more reason you got to engage with them. That's what I talked about, the echo chamber. Even the PM should not live in an echo chamber of his bureaucrats, of his ministers who say, yes, Modi ji, yes, Modi ji. You've got to have a no Modi ji also. So that's my opinion on the press conference. Well, thank you all for watching. We'll be back again next week. Thank you to all guests, Vatsala, of course, Alisa and Parth. Thank you very much, and thank you all for watching. And as I said, we'll be back next week with more views and hopefully more unbiased interpretation. Thank you.